The letter showed up on a Tuesday, stuck under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket, except it was sitting in my own driveway. It was 11 degrees outside with a wind chill that would freeze your nose hair solid in about 30 seconds, and someone had walked all the way up my driveway in that weather just to leave me a violation notice. I stood there in my work boots, coat half-zipped, staring at the little white envelope with the Maplewood Ridge HOA logo printed in the top left corner, and I already knew before I even opened it that Donna Crane was behind whatever was inside. I'm Paul Mitchell, and before you ask, no, not the shampoo guy. I've lived in Maplewood Ridge for 6 years, and for 6 years I've had a perfectly decent relationship with most of my neighbors. Cookouts in summer, waves across the driveway in fall, that kind of thing. The community itself isn't bad. Nice streets, decent landscaping, a little park at the end of the cul-de-sac that the kids use in warmer months. The problem with Maplewood Ridge has never been the community. The problem has always been Donna Crane. Donna Crane moved into the neighborhood about 4 years ago and inserted herself onto the HOA board within her first 6 months. Within a year, she was effectively running the whole operation, not because she was elected to any particularly powerful position, but because she simply out-exhausted everyone else. She showed up to every meeting. She sent more emails than anyone could ever read. She filed complaints about things that most normal human beings would never even notice. The other board members, 2 retired guys named Hank and Gerald, mostly just wanted to be left alone and would agree to almost anything Donna proposed just to end the conversation and get back to their respective lives. That dynamic gave Donna enormous real-world power despite having the official title of Community Standards Coordinator, which was a position she had essentially invented for herself and gotten the board to ratify during a poorly attended summer meeting. Donna was the kind of person who used the phrase, per our community guidelines, the way other people use punctuation. She sent official-looking notices for things like trash cans being 1 inch too far from the curb, holiday decorations still up on January 3rd, and vehicles parked on the street for longer than 12 hours even during snowstorms when people physically couldn't move them. She had a way of framing every single complaint as if she were doing you a personal favor by bringing it to your attention, which made it about twice as infuriating as if she'd just been openly aggressive about it. I knew all of this before I opened that envelope, and yet somehow I still wasn't completely prepared for what was inside. The letter informed me that I had been observed operating a gas-powered auger on my residential property on December 14th, that this activity had generated what the notice described as excessive mechanical noise inconsistent with the residential character of the community, and that I was in violation of Section 7, Subsection 4, Paragraph C of the Maplewood Ridge HOA Community Standards, which pertain to the use of commercial or industrial-grade power equipment on residential lots without prior written board approval. The proposed fine was $250, and I had 14 days to either pay it or request a formal hearing. I read that thing 3 times standing in my driveway in 11-degree weather before I went back inside. Here's the thing. Here's the context that makes this whole situation so breathtakingly absurd. It was December. We had gotten 14 inches of snow in Maplewood Ridge starting on December 10th, which was followed by a temperature crash that drove the mercury down to about 6 degrees by the 12th. When that happens, the ground doesn't just get cold, it freezes solid. And I mean solid, like concrete. I'm talking permafrost-level freeze where you stomp on what looks like dirt, and it sounds like you're kicking a parking lot. The reason I needed to break through frozen ground in the first place was my propane line. I heat my house with a propane system, and I have a buried supply line that runs from the tank on the side of my house underground to the furnace connection point on the back of the foundation. I'd had a slow leak developing in that line since late fall, professionally diagnosed by my HVAC contractor in November. He'd advised me to get the connection replaced before winter really hit, and I'd scheduled it, but the appointment kept getting pushed because the company was slammed with other pre-winter work. By December 14th, when the line finally started leaking enough to actually drop pressure in my system, I was looking at a situation where my furnace could potentially shut down if the leak got worse. In the middle of a stretch of weather where nighttime temperatures were dropping below zero, that's not a comfort issue. That's a safety issue. My HVAC contractor, a guy named Terry Briggs who'd been doing this work for 22 years, showed up on the morning of the 14th and took one look at the frozen ground over the buried line connection point and shook his head. The frost line had gone down about 16 inches. The ground was like iron. He had a small hand-operated breaker with him, but said it would take hours to chip through, and he wasn't going to charge me for that kind of labor time when there was a faster and safer option. He said he had a gas-powered one-man auger on his truck that he could use to bore through the frozen crust cleanly, access the line, make the repair, and have the whole thing wrapped up in a couple of hours versus potentially the entire day. I said go for it. The auger ran for maybe 45 minutes, tops. Terry is a professional. He wasn't out there hot-dogging around my backyard. He drilled the access point, they got the line exposed, they fixed the connection, they backfilled, and they were done. The whole repair job was finished by early afternoon. My furnace was running properly again by 2 o'clock, and I had heat going into what turned out to be the coldest night of the year so far, with temperatures dropping to -4 by midnight. So that was December 14th. By Tuesday the 17th, I had a violation notice under my windshield wiper. I knew Donna had been watching. Her house is diagonally across from mine, and she has what I can only describe as an observatory window setup in her front room, where she seems to spend a significant portion of her time. She had clearly seen or heard Terry's auger, decided it was her business, and filed the complaint through the HOA machinery that she herself largely operated. The thing about Donna and her $250 fine attempt was that it was actually, from a pure reading of the rules she'd cited, pretty weak. I knew that. But I also knew that Donna was counting on me to just pay the fine the way a lot of homeowners do, because fighting an HOA over a couple $100 is tedious, and most people figure the time isn't worth it. That calculation is exactly how HOA overreach survives. People pay the smaller fines because the hassle isn't worth it, which reinforces the behavior, which makes the fines more frequent, which makes Donna more emboldened. I had been just patient enough with Donna Crane over the past few years. I had been a good sport when she dinged me for leaving my basketball hoop at the end of my driveway one weekend while my nephew visited. I had been gracious when she knocked on my door to let me know, very helpfully, that my gutters might benefit from a professional cleaning, because she'd noticed some debris from the street. I had swallowed a lot of Donna interactions over the years with a polite nod and a closed door. This one I was not letting go. I called my neighbor Rich Battaglia that evening. Rich lives 3 houses down, he's a retired civil attorney, and he has roughly the same feelings about Donna Crane that most of the street does. He picks up on the second ring. "Donna hit you with something," he says, before I even say why I'm calling. $250 for using an auger to access my propane line during a frozen ground emergency. There's a pause, and then he laughs. Not a mean laugh, just the laugh of a man who has seen a lot of things in his life and has an appreciation for audacity. "Send me the notice," he says. "I'll read the section she cited tonight." Rich calls me back about an hour later. He's been reading through the actual HOA governing documents, which I had a copy of somewhere in a filing cabinet, but Rich had apparently digitized his entire set of community documents at some point, which is exactly the kind of thing Rich does. He tells me a few things that are useful. First, Section 7, Subsection 4, Paragraph C, which Donna cited, is actually about homeowners who bring in commercial landscaping or construction equipment for extended projects, like repaving driveways or excavating pools or doing landscaping overhauls. The language specifically says extended or recurring use, and the intent is clearly to prevent someone from running a commercial roofing operation out of their house or something like that. A one-time, 45-minute use of an auger to access an underground utility line during an emergency does not obviously fall within that language. Second, and this is the part I found really interesting, the HOA governing documents contain what is known as a utility access carve-out, which is a standard provision in a lot of HOA documents that essentially says that nothing in the community standards shall interfere with a homeowner's ability to access, maintain, or repair utility infrastructure on their property. It's in there because HOAs legally cannot prevent you from doing necessary utility work. Full stop. Donna had either not read that section, hadn't understood it, or had just decided to ignore it and see if I would pay anyway. Third thing Rich mentions, almost as an afterthought, is that the fine itself is procedurally questionable because the notice doesn't include any specific reference to which board member or officer issued it. Just the HOA letterhead and Donna's somewhat illegible signature at the bottom in her capacity as Community Standards Coordinator. Depending on how the bylaws are written, fines above a certain dollar amount may require full board approval, not just one coordinator's sign-off. By the time I hang up with Rich, I'm feeling significantly better. I sit down that evening at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the snow that had started falling again outside my window, the street lamps throwing yellow light across the white lawn, and I start putting together my written response. I'm not a lawyer, I want to be clear about that, but I'm reasonably good at reading documents and putting together a clear argument. I spent 2 hours on that letter. I addressed the utility access provision directly. I quoted the language of Section 7, subsection 4, paragraph C back to Donna, and explained why a single 45-minute emergency repair access did not constitute extended or recurring use of commercial equipment. I included a copy of the invoice from Terry Briggs's company documenting the nature of the repair, the date, and the duration of work performed. I noted the propane line leak diagnosis from November and attached a copy of that documentation as well. I flagged the utility access carve-out provision and referenced it by section number. And I politely but firmly noted that I would be requesting a formal board hearing per the process described in the notice, and that I would be presenting all of the above documentation at that hearing. I sent it certified mail the next morning. Certified mail is a small but meaningful move because it establishes that you sent something and when, and it signals to the recipient that you're serious and organized. Now, here is where things start getting more interesting, because Donna Crane is not the kind of person who receives a polite but firm rebuttal and says, "Well, fair enough, let's drop it." Donna Crane is the kind of person who receives a challenge and doubles down. Within 3 days, I had a second letter. This one informed me that my request for a hearing had been received and acknowledged, and that the hearing was scheduled for January 4th, which was about 2.5 weeks out. It also informed me that while my documentation had been noted, the board wished to clarify that the utility access provision referenced in your response applies specifically to access required by licensed utility companies and municipal entities, not to private contractors performing residential repairs. It was signed, again, by Donna. I stared at that paragraph for a while. That interpretation of the utility access clause was, to be extremely polite about it, creative. I had read the clause. It does not say anything remotely like that. It says homeowners have the right to access utility infrastructure. It does not specify that only municipal entities can do the work. That limitation was something Donna had apparently just made up out of thin air and put into an official-looking letter, presumably hoping I didn't actually have the document in front of me. I called Rich. "She fabricated an interpretation," I said. "I know," he said. "I just read it. That clause does not say what she claims it says. Can she just do that, just invent a meaning for a rule?" "She can try," Rich said. "That's what the hearing is for. Paul, bring everything. Bring Terry if he's willing to come. Get statements from the other homeowners if you can. Don't just make this about the legal text. Make it about what actually happened." That was good advice. I spent the next couple of weeks preparing for January 4th with more focus than I think I've brought to anything in the past few years. Part of that was principle. Part of it was that I'd been letting Donna's little power moves accumulate for years and I was done. In the meantime, the weather was absolutely punishing. December rolled through with almost no warmth at all. We got 2 more significant snowfalls after the 14th, one of about 8 inches and one of about 5. The streets in Maplewood Ridge were getting increasingly difficult, not just from the snow, but from the ice that was building up underneath it because the temperatures just weren't getting warm enough to allow any meaningful melt. People were digging their cars out with ice scrapers and snow blowers every other day. The roads into the neighborhood were a mess of packed snow and ice ruts that made every trip in or out feel like a minor adventure. During this period, I started talking to more of my neighbors than I normally would, partly because the snowfall kept creating these little communal moments where people ended up outside at the same time shoveling driveways and helping each other out. There is something about sustained bad weather that either brings neighbors together or drives everyone into their houses. In our case, it was mostly the former. I talked to Carla Jeffers, who lives next door to me on the south side. Carla told me she'd gotten a notice about her snow blower allegedly being stored in a manner inconsistent with community aesthetic standards because she'd left it on her porch for a few days during an active snowfall period. She'd paid the fine, $50, without pushing back because she didn't know she could. I talked to Marcus Webb, who lives across the street and one house down. Marcus told me Donna had hit him with a notice the previous winter for using a portable propane heater on his driveway while doing some work on his car during a cold snap, citing fire hazard proximity rules in a way Marcus felt was completely misapplied. He'd also paid. I talked to the Hendersons, an older couple at the end of the block, who had received multiple notices over the past 2 years for various things, including one memorable incident where Donna had cited them for a temporary wooden ramp that their son had built so that his mother could get in and out of the house more easily following a hip surgery. That one had actually been challenged by the Hendersons, who had pointed out that the ramp was an Ada-style accommodation for a medical need, and Donna had backed off on that one, but not before putting them through enough stress about it that they'd considered selling the house. The thought of an elderly couple in declining health being harassed over a medical necessity ramp was honestly the thing that made me the most angry out of everything I'd heard. What was becoming clear as I talked to people was that Donna had been using the fine system essentially as a revenue mechanism and a control mechanism, issuing citations for things that either didn't violate the actual rules or where the rules were being applied in wildly stretched interpretations. The fine money went into the HOA operating account, and while the HOA's finances were technically subject to board review, Hank and Gerald had not been reviewing them with any rigor. Donna had been effectively controlling the flow of money as well. The day before the January 4th hearing, I got a phone call I wasn't expecting. It was from a woman named Patricia Sloan, who lives on the other side of the neighborhood, the section I didn't interact with much because it was about a 5-minute walk, and the layout of the streets meant there wasn't much reason to go that way. Patricia had heard through various neighbor conversations that I was fighting a fine and preparing for a hearing, and she wanted to tell me something. Patricia told me that she had documented, over the past roughly 2 years, every single HOA fine notice that had been issued in Maplewood Ridge, along with the corresponding section and subsection citations, whether they had been paid or contested, and roughly what the outcome had been. She had done this because she had initially found herself spending a lot of time trying to understand why the neighborhood seemed to be getting notices more frequently than she would expect, and she had started keeping a log just to understand the pattern. What her log showed was that in the 2 years since Donna had taken on the Community Standards Coordinator role, HOA fine revenue had increased by about 340% compared to the 2 years prior. Over 60% of those fines had been for equipment or property maintenance issues, specifically the category that fell under Section 7. And of the fines that had been challenged or contested, the HOA had backed down or reduced the fine in over 80% of cases, which meant that the system was pretty clearly being used to collect money from people who didn't know they could fight it. Patricia had all of this in a spreadsheet. She emailed it to me that night. I printed it out and added it to my folder. The January 4th hearing was held at 7 in the evening in the small community room at the end of the neighborhood park building, which was basically a converted storage space with a folding table and some stackable chairs that smelled faintly of must. The room was heated at least, though not particularly well, and everyone who showed up kept their coats on. I had not expected much of an audience. The notice I'd received said I could bring one representative or support person, and I'd asked Rich to come as my informal legal support. I had also, as permitted under the hearing process, asked Terry Briggs if he'd come, and he had agreed, saying it was the least he could do since it was his equipment that had caused the whole thing. Terry showed up in his company jacket with a printed copy of his work order and a no-nonsense attitude. What I had not expected was for 8 other neighbors to show up, uninvited in any formal sense, just as observers. Carla was there. Marcus was there. The Hendersons came, which genuinely touched me because it was a cold night and Mr. Henderson had a bad back. Patricia Sloan came, with her laptop. A few other faces I recognized from around the neighborhood. Donna Crane sat at the folding table with Hank and Gerald flanking her. Hank looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Gerald had brought a thermos of coffee and kept staring at it. Donna looked at the assembled audience, and her expression did something complicated. She had clearly expected this to be a quick, quiet formality. The room full of neighbors had not been part of her plan. She opened the hearing in a businesslike way, summarizing the violation, citing the section, and explaining that the board was present to review my response and determine whether the fine stood. Then she made a mistake. She said, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, that while she appreciated that the homeowner claimed to have a utility emergency, the board had no way to verify that claim, and that many homeowners attempt to characterize ordinary elective improvements as emergency situations in order to circumvent the approval process. She said this with the particular kind of practice smoothness that people use when they've said something several times before and have gotten away with it. I let her finish. Then I put Terry Briggs forward first. Terry laid out the situation clearly, professionally, and in the kind of specific technical language that makes it hard to dismiss. He explained the propane line leak diagnosis from November, the nature of the ground freeze they encountered on December 14th, the specific reason the auger was used, how long it ran, and the documentation he'd prepared. He put his work order on the table. Donna said that while she respected Mr. Briggs's profession, the question wasn't whether there had been a repair, but whether the equipment used required prior board approval under Section 7. I read Section 7, subsection 4, paragraph C aloud, all of it, including the phrase extended or recurring use. I then read the utility access carve-out provision. I then said, very calmly, that the letter I'd received 3 days after my original response had characterized this provision as applying only to licensed utility companies and municipal entities, and I asked the board to identify where in the provision that limitation appeared, because I had the document in front of me and I could not locate it. Hank looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at his thermos. Donna said that was a matter of interpretation. Rich spoke up at that point. He said that when a contract or governing document is ambiguous, the interpretation is supposed to be applied in favor of the party that did not draft the document, which in this case was me, and that in any event the language in question was not ambiguous, it was simply being misrepresented. Donna's jaw tightened. Then Patricia Sloan raised her hand and asked if she could share some information that she believed was relevant to the board's broader context for decision-making. Donna tried to say that this was a focused hearing about a specific violation, but Hank, perhaps sensing that something was about to happen and wanting to be on the right side of it, said he thought the board should hear what Patricia had to say. Patricia connected her laptop to the little projector in the corner of the room that was usually used for showing photos at neighborhood meetings, and she put up her spreadsheet. She walked through it. She didn't editorialize much. She just showed the data. The 340% increase in fine revenue, the concentration of fines in Section 7, the 80+% backdown rate on contested fines. She showed the timeline clearly, noting that the acceleration in fines corresponded directly with Donna taking on the community standards coordinator role. The room was very quiet. Gerald set down his thermos. Mr. Henderson, from the back of the room, said in a clear voice that he had received a notice about his wife's medical access ramp, and he would like the board to explain the legal basis for that citation. Carla said she had paid a fine she now believed she should not have had to pay, and she'd like to know the process for getting a refund. Marcus said the same thing about his propane heater citation. Donna was trying to maintain control of the room, but it was visibly slipping. She kept saying things like, "These are separate issues, and let's stay focused, and there is an established process for these concerns." But the established process was her process, and the people in the room had stopped accepting that framing. Hank, who I'd always written off as a passive rubber stamp, cleared his throat and said something that surprised me. He said he thought the board should table the fine in Paul's case, pending a full review of Section 7 and the utility access provision, and that he thought the board should also engage an independent HOA management consultant to review the fine history of the past 2 years. Donna looked at him like he just suggested they all go swimming in the snow outside. Gerald said he seconded the motion. Donna was outvoted. The fine was tabled that night, and Hank and Gerald voted to initiate the review process. I went home in the cold January air feeling, for the first time in weeks, genuinely satisfied. But here is where the story keeps going, because the hearing wasn't the end of it. About a week after the January 4th hearing, Patricia was contacted by a homeowner from the back section of the neighborhood, a quiet guy named Tom Vargas, who said he wanted to share something. Tom had been on the HOA mailing list for years and had kept every email he'd ever received from the board. He'd been reading through old threads in connection with what was happening, and he had come across something that made him uncomfortable. Tom had found a chain of emails, about 8 months old, in which Donna had discussed with what appeared to be a private landscaping contractor the possibility of directing HOA contract work to that contractor, and in the same thread had suggested that by increasing citation activity related to landscaping and property maintenance, she could help generate demand for the contractor's services among homeowners who received violation notices and wanted to quickly bring their properties into compliance. I want you to let that sink in for a second. What Tom had found looked a lot like Donna running a scheme where she was issuing fines to homeowners and simultaneously steering them toward a contractor she had a relationship with, presumably for some kind of referral benefit. Tom forwarded the email chain to Rich, who read it twice and then said, very quietly, "This is not just an HOA abuse of power situation anymore." Rich said what Tom had documented, if the emails were authentic and their interpretation was correct, could constitute a form of fraud. Using a position of authority to generate financial benefit through a scheme like that wasn't just a policy violation. It was potentially criminal. Rich was careful about it. He wasn't going to wave the word fraud around carelessly. He said the right move was to take what we had to an attorney who specialized in HOA and real estate law and get a proper opinion before doing anything else. I connected with a woman named Janet Cho, a real estate and HOA attorney in the area who had been recommended by someone in a local homeowners network. Janet reviewed the emails, reviewed Patricia's spreadsheet, reviewed the governing documents, and reviewed the specific fine notices that multiple homeowners had received. Her opinion was that the email chain strongly suggested what she called self-dealing arrangement, and that combined with the pattern of fines and their concentration in areas that would logically send homeowners to landscaping and property maintenance contractors, there was sufficient basis to file a complaint with the State Consumer Protection Bureau and potentially with law enforcement. She also noted that Donna's role as Community Standards Coordinator technically gave her a fiduciary duty to the homeowners in Maplewood Ridge, meaning she was legally obligated to act in the community's interest rather than her own financial interest, and that the emails suggested she had been doing exactly the opposite. Janet filed the consumer protection complaint on behalf of several homeowners, including me, in late January. Rich and I also went to the local police department's financial crimes unit and brought the full package: the emails, the spreadsheet, Janet's opinion letter, the documentation of fines issued, and a timeline. The detective we spoke to, a methodical woman named Officer Brenda Hallstrom, listened to the whole thing without interrupting, read through the key documents, and asked a number of specific questions about how the HOA governance was structured and how funds were collected and reported. She said she would look into it. In the meantime, the independent HOA management consultant that Hank and Gerald had voted to bring in was doing his own work. His name was Frank Dorsey, and he'd been hired from a firm that specifically handled HOA governance reviews. Frank spent about 3 weeks going through the financial records, the fine history, the board meeting minutes, and the contractor records. His report was issued in mid-February, and it was not good for Donna. Frank's findings included the fact that the landscaping contractor identified in Tom's emails had received 3 HOA contracts over the past 18 months, all awarded without a competitive bidding process, as was technically required by the HOA's own operating rules for contracts above a certain dollar threshold. He also found that fine revenue that had been collected above a certain account threshold, money that was supposed to be held in reserve, had instead been repeatedly transferred to the general operating account and had been used for expenditures that included what appeared to be vendor payments that Frank could not match to any documented service delivered to the community. That last part was the most serious piece. There was money that had come in from homeowner fines and appeared to have gone out to what Frank diplomatically called unsubstantiated vendor expenses, meaning he could not find any evidence of actual services provided in exchange for those payments. The police investigation had been moving in parallel with all of this. Officer Hallstrom came back to Rich and me in late February to let us know that her unit had subpoenaed the HOA financial records and had been in contact with the contractor mentioned in the emails. I won't get into all the details of that investigation because I was not privy to all of it, but the picture that emerged was consistent with what Frank Dorsey had found. Donna Crane was arrested in the first week of March. It was, I will admit, a strange morning. The kind of thing you think about theoretically when you're writing a response letter about an auger and a frozen propane line, but that you don't fully expect to actually happen. A police car was parked in front of her house in the early morning, and the neighbors who were out salting their driveways and warming up their cars watched Donna walk out in her coat with an officer beside her. She didn't make a scene. She was charged with fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of funds, the specific counts depending on what the investigation had fully documented. The charges were real, and the case moved forward through the legal system. I won't pretend I followed every step of the court process, but what happened over the next several months was that Donna entered into a plea agreement that involved repayment of misappropriated funds, which were determined to be somewhere in the range of $12,000 over the period of the scheme, as well as a period of probation and a requirement to complete financial ethics coursework. She resigned from the HOA immediately, obviously, and was barred from serving in any capacity in a homeowners association in the state going forward. The contractor who had been involved was separately sanctioned and faced civil liability, though I understand that resolution took longer to work out and wasn't something I tracked as closely. Hank and Gerald, for their part, were not found to have been complicit in the scheme. They were found to have been negligent in their oversight, which is a different thing, and the independent review resulted in significant recommendations for stronger governance, including mandatory financial audits, a proper competitive bidding process for contracts, and a requirement that any fines above a certain amount require full board approval with written documentation of the rationale. All of the fines that had been improperly issued were reviewed. The ones that were determined to have been issued without valid basis, which included most of the ones I've described in this story, were refunded. Carla got her $50 back. Marcus got his back. The Hendersons didn't have any money to get back because Donna had apparently backed off on their ramp citation before collecting anything, but they did receive a formal written apology from the newly reconstituted board, which mattered to them. I got my $250 fine officially withdrawn, and a written notice confirming that my property was in good standing, which I framed and put in my garage because I felt like it. The neighborhood spent that winter slowly healing from the Donna era in small ways. The HOA meeting in March, the first one after her arrest, was attended by more homeowners than any meeting I'd ever seen in Maplewood Ridge. People who had never come before showed up because they finally felt like it was worth engaging. The meeting ran long because people had a lot to say, but it was productive, and there was a kind of released energy in the room that felt genuinely good. The board was reconstituted with proper elections. 3 new members came on board, including, to my great satisfaction, Patricia Sloan, whose spreadsheet had done more to expose the problem than almost anything else. Patricia turned out to be an excellent board member who had a practical, evidence-based approach to everything she touched, which is exactly what the board needed. Rich Battaglia also joined the Governance Advisory Committee that was set up as part of the post-Donna reforms, which meant the board had actual legal knowledge available to it, rather than just Donna's creative interpretations of documents she wrote herself. Terry Briggs, for his part, became something of a local legend in the neighborhood. I had several neighbors ask me for his contact information after hearing what had happened, and he ended up doing a few other utility and HVAC jobs in Maplewood Ridge that year. He told me once with genuine bemusement that he'd never expected a propane line repair to turn into a whole thing, and I told him neither had I. The propane line itself, the whole reason any of this started, held up fine through the rest of winter. No more leaks. The repair Terry had made on that frozen December morning, the one that required breaking through 16 inches of iron-hard frozen ground with a gas-powered auger, worked exactly as intended. My heat ran all winter without a problem. Through the -4 nights of mid-December, through the January cold snaps, through the February thaw that wasn't really much of a thaw, my house stayed warm. I think about that sometimes, about how the whole chain of events started with something as practical and obvious as keeping my family warm. I needed a propane line fixed. Terry had the right tool for the job. The ground was frozen solid. He used the auger, fixed the line, and I had heat that night. That's a complete story in itself. It's not complicated. It doesn't require any drama or documentation or spreadsheets. The drama came along because someone decided that her authority over the neighborhood aesthetics extended to my utility access, and that a quarter-inch line in an HOA document could be stretched to mean whatever was convenient at the time. The drama came because enough homeowners had been quietly absorbing small injustices long enough that when someone finally pushed back, there turned out to be quite a bit of compressed frustration looking for an outlet. I don't think I did anything heroic. I read the rules. I sent a certified letter. I went to a hearing. I talked to my neighbors. The situation revealed itself because when one person stopped absorbing the fine and started asking questions, other people felt safe enough to add what they knew, and the pattern that had been invisible in isolation became obvious when you looked at it all together. The winter eventually ended. By late March, the snow had pulled back and the ground thawed out and the grass started showing through in soggy patches. The trees were doing the thing they do where the buds appear before you'd think it was warm enough for that. Kids were back in the park at the end of the cul-de-sac. People were out on their driveways washing their cars, checking for road salt damage on their undersides, doing the small maintenance tasks that come with the end of winter. Maplewood Ridge looked the same from the outside as it always had. Same streets, same houses, same landscaping going through its seasonal reset. But something had changed in the fabric of the place, in the way people talked to each other, and what they felt they were allowed to say. A woman I barely knew stopped me in my driveway one Saturday afternoon in April, a younger woman who'd moved in about a year before all of this happened, and she said she hadn't really known her neighbors before all of this, had just kept to herself and gone to work, but that now she felt like she actually lived in a neighborhood and not just a street. I said I knew what she meant. I thought about that letter under my windshield wiper. 11 degrees, $250. Section 7, subsection 4, paragraph C. Donna Crane's signature in blue ink at the bottom. Sometimes the smallest, most absurd overreach is the thing that finally tips the balance. Not because it's the worst thing, but because it happens at the moment when someone has run out of patience for absorbing it quietly. I'd paid fines before. I'd nodded and moved on. I'd let it go because it wasn't worth it. The auger was worth it. The propane line was worth it. 45 minutes of mechanical noise on a cold December morning that kept my house from losing heat on a night when the temperature went to -4 turned out to be worth fighting for. Not just because of what it was, but because of what refusing to fight it would have meant. I kept the certified mail receipt, the hearing notice, the withdrawn fine letter, and Patricia's spreadsheet in a folder in my filing cabinet, next to the HOA governing documents. Not as trophies exactly, more as a reminder that the rules are only as good as the people reading them, and that reading them yourself is always, always worth the trouble. The gas-powered auger sat in Terry Briggs's truck through all of it, completely unaware of the chain of events it had inadvertently set in motion. A tool used correctly for exactly the purpose it was designed for, on frozen ground in December, by a professional doing his job. 2 hours of work that saved my heating system, and as it turned out, helped save a neighborhood from the slow drain of one person's greed and entitled authority. I'd call that a pretty good return on 45 minutes of mechanical noise. The next winter came, as they do, with the same 14 inches in early December, the same temperature crash, the same ice-hardened roads and frost-line troubles. The neighborhood dealt with it the same way it always had: shovels, snow blowers, helping each other dig out, the communal rhythm of people making the best of a shared difficulty. Except this time, when people got outside to deal with the snow, they talked to each other a little more easily. They helped a little more freely. They argued at board meetings and brought concerns to the new board members and trusted that when they raised an issue it would be dealt with transparently. The HOA still existed. HOAs don't go away. But it had stopped being a thing that happened to people in Maplewood Ridge and started being a thing that belonged to them. That's a significant distinction, and it matters more than any single fine. Donna Crane's house sold in late summer. The new family that moved in had 2 young kids and a Labrador retriever who seemed deeply enthusiastic about the snow when it arrived in December. Nobody issued them any notices. Nobody watched from an observatory window to see whether their equipment was generating mechanical noise inconsistent with the residential character of the community. They just moved in and became part of the neighborhood, which is exactly how it's supposed to work. I waved at them from my driveway one morning when we were both out dealing with a fresh 6 inches that had come down overnight. They waved back. The Labrador stuck its face in a snowdrift and seemed to find this hilarious. The snow was coming down again, light and steady, the kind of winter morning that doesn't carry any menace in it, just the quiet work of being somewhere cold and making the best of it alongside the people you happen to share a street with. My furnace ran without a problem all through that second winter. The propane line held. The repair Terry had made on that frozen December day, the one that started all of this, was solid and reliable and asked nothing more of me except an annual check which I made sure to schedule in October from then on so that nobody would ever have to break through frozen ground for me again, at least not if I could help it. And if they ever did, I knew exactly what the rules said about it.